April 23rd, 1945, the limestone cave near Shuri, Okinawa. 16-year-old Miyagi Kikuko pressed herself against the damp cave wall, clutching her 4-year-old brother as explosions rattled the entrance. The air reeked of sulfur, decay, and human waste from 300 villagers packed into darkness. Outside, American voices called in broken Japanese, "Come out, we will not hurt you." Nobody moved. They had been told what Americans did to prisoners. This moment would shatter everything the Okinawan people believed about their fate. The Battle of Okinawa had begun 82 days earlier, on April 1st, 1945, when 183,000 American troops landed on the island's western beaches. The Japanese 32nd Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, had prepared an elaborate defense-in-depth strategy using Okinawa's rugged terrain and over 1,000 caves. But caught between these two military forces were 470,000 Okinawan civilians who would experience the most devastating land battle of the Pacific War. What none of them knew was that they were about to witness the largest humanitarian rescue operation in the Pacific theater, one that would save over 200,000 civilian lives through a systematic American effort that contradicted every word of Japanese propaganda. The Japanese military government had spent months preparing the Okinawan population for American invasion with a propaganda campaign of systematic terror. Governor Akira Shimada's office distributed pamphlets throughout the island depicting Americans as demons who would torture, rape, and murder every civilian they encountered. School teachers drilled children on the phrase, 7 lives for one's country, encouraging mass suicide rather than capture. Miyagi Kikuko had attended these sessions at her school in Naha. The teacher showed us pictures, she would recall in a 1997 interview with the Okinawa Prefectural Peace Memorial Museum. American soldiers with horns, holding bloody knives, she told us they would do unspeakable things to girls and women. Death was preferable to capture. We believed her completely. The Japanese military distributed 2 items to civilian families across Okinawa in March 1945, hand grenades and detailed instructions for committing group suicide. Approximately 20,000 grenades were given to civilians, 1 for every family group. Village leaders received orders to ensure no one surrendered alive. But the Americans had learned from previous island campaigns. The mass civilian deaths at Saipan in June 1944, where thousands jumped from cliffs rather than surrender, had shocked American commanders. For Okinawa, they prepared differently. Before I continue, I want to hear from you. Comment below where you're watching from and what time it is in your location right now. And if you're finding this story as incredible as I am, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next, because what these civilians discovered would change everything they believed about their enemies. The United States 10th Army established the military government section specifically for civilian affairs, staffed with over 300 officers who had studied Okinawan culture, language, and customs. Captain David Swift, a former anthropology professor from the University of Michigan, had spent 6 months preparing civilian rescue protocols. His February 1945 report outlined the challenge with brutal clarity. We must overcome 3 years of systematic terror propaganda while conducting active combat operations. Every civilian will believe we intend to kill them. The American strategy combined 3 elements: Japanese language broadcasts from offshore ships, leaflets dropped by aircraft, and most crucially, treating the first captured civilians with such obvious care that word would spread through the civilian population still in hiding. Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Anderson, chief of the 10th Army's Civil Affairs section, later wrote, "We understood that actions would matter more than words. The first 100 civilians we captured would determine whether thousands more surrendered or died fighting us or by their own hand." The first major test came on April 7, 1945, in the village of Zamami on the Kerama Islands, small islands west of Okinawa proper. The 77th Infantry Division landed expecting light resistance, but instead found a population of 600 civilians preparing for mass suicide. Village headman Umeki Yoshiaki had gathered families at the shrine, distributing grenades as American troops approached the village center. What happened next was recorded in the combat diary of Sergeant James Wheeler. "We heard screaming from the shrine area. Captain ordered us to approach slowly, weapons lowered, used the interpreter to call out that we had food and medicine. No one believed us. Then Private Nakamura, our Nisei translator, started singing an Okinawan folk song his grandmother had taught him. An old woman emerged. She was crying, said she thought all Americans were white. The old woman was Taira Hana, 73 years old. In her testimony preserved by the Himeori Peace Museum, she recalled, "I heard our song, our words. I thought, how can demons know our songs? I came out expecting to die. Instead, a young man with a Japanese face but American uniform handed me a chocolate bar and asked if I was injured. I could not comprehend it. Within 2 hours, all 600 villagers of Zamami had surrendered. Not a single civilian died. The Americans established an immediate aid station, distributing rations, treating the sick, and most importantly, allowing the villagers to send messages to relatives on the main island. This pattern would repeat across Okinawa. As American forces pushed inland, they encountered thousands of civilians hiding in caves, many near death from starvation and disease. The civilian population had been surviving on approximately 400 calories daily, less than a third of subsistence level. Dysentery, malaria, and typhus swept through cave shelters, where hundreds huddled in darkness. Miyagi Kikuko's cave was typical. By late April, 23 of the 300 people had died from disease. The elderly went first, then infants. Her mother had stopped producing milk. Her brother had not eaten in 3 days. "We were ghosts waiting to become corpses," she recalled. When the Americans called into the cave, some people wanted to use the grenades. Others argued we should see if the stories from Zamami were true, that some villagers had surrendered and lived. The debate raged for 2 days, while American forces waited outside. Captain Robert Finn, leading the rescue effort at this particular cave, established a perimeter but refused to use force. "I had orders to wait," he later testified. "We broadcast messages, left food at the entrance, demonstrated through interpreters that we meant no harm. It was psychological warfare in reverse, trying to prove we weren't the monsters they expected." On April 26, 1945, the first person emerged from the cave. But what that person discovered outside would shatter every assumption about American intentions, creating a cascade effect that would save thousands of lives in the coming weeks. The question wasn't whether Americans could defeat the Japanese military on Okinawa. The question was whether they could defeat 3 years of propaganda in the minds of starving civilians who had been trained to fear rescue more than death itself. The elderly woman who emerged from Miyagi Kikuko's cave on April 26th collapsed immediately into the arms of an American corpsman. She weighed 68 pounds. Within minutes, she was receiving intravenous saline and glucose, while a Navy doctor examined her for injuries. The transformation of enemy propaganda into observable reality was about to accelerate beyond anything the Japanese military had anticipated. Corporal Thomas Chen, a Chinese-American medic from San Francisco, was the first to treat the woman. His after-action report, filed on April 27th, documented what happened next. Patient was severely dehydrated and malnourished but responsive, administered IV fluids, and provided soft food. Patient kept asking through interpreter if we were going to kill her. When I explained we were treating her injuries, she began crying uncontrollably. Within 30 minutes of treatment, she insisted on returning to the cave entrance to call others out. What the woman saw contradicted 3 years of systematic indoctrination. The American aid station established outside the cave complex resembled a civilian hospital more than a military operation. Rows of cots under canvas tents, medical supplies, stacked in organized piles, Navy corpsmen treating injured civilians with the same care given to American wounded. Japanese-speaking Nisei soldiers moved among patients, translating, reassuring, distributing food. The woman returned to the cave entrance and shouted a single sentence that would save 279 lives: "They are feeding us!" Over the next 4 hours, the entire cave population emerged. Mothers carrying dying infants, elderly men who could barely walk, teenagers supporting wounded relatives. Each expected execution. Each received food, water, and medical treatment instead. Miyagi Kikuko, clutching her brother, watched an American soldier heat canned milk over a portable stove and hand it to her mother. He smiled, she recalled. A genuine smile, not the cruel grin we had been told Americans wore before they killed. My brother drank the milk and fell asleep in my arms. That was the moment I knew we had been lied to about everything. The systematic American civilian rescue operation on Okinawa represented the most comprehensive humanitarian effort attempted during active combat in World War II. The scale was unprecedented. Between April 1st and June 22, 1945, American forces would process, feed, shelter, and provide medical care to over 200,000 Okinawan civilians while simultaneously fighting the most brutal land battle of the Pacific War. The architecture of this operation revealed American understanding that saving civilians was both a moral imperative and a military necessity. Every civilian who surrendered peacefully was one fewer potential suicide attacker, one less person the Japanese military could use as a human shield, one more voice testifying that American promises were genuine. Lieutenant Colonel Anderson's Civil Affairs section established 16 civilian internment camps across occupied Okinawa by early May. The term internment was misleading. These were essentially refugee processing centers designed to provide immediate humanitarian aid before civilians could return to secured areas. The largest, Camp Ishikawa, on the western coast, housed over 70,000 people at peak capacity. The conditions at these camps became the most powerful counter-propaganda tool in the American arsenal. Each camp featured organized sanitation, medical facilities, food distribution centers, and family registration services to reunite separated relatives. The daily calorie ration for civilians exceeded 2,000 calories, more than 5 times what they had been surviving on in caves. Army photographer Sergeant William McKinney documented Camp Ishikawa in May 1945. His photographs, preserved in the National Archives, show organized rows of tents, civilians receiving medical examinations, children playing while parents registered with camp administrators, food distribution lines operating with military efficiency. In one image, Okinawan women are shown operating a camp kitchen under American supervision, cooking rice in quantities that would have seemed impossible weeks earlier. Democracy through abundance. But the most powerful evidence came from an unexpected source. The children, kids who had been taught to fear Americans as demons, discovered soldiers who shared chocolate, played games, and established makeshift schools. Corporal Daniel Rodriguez from Texas started a baseball program at Camp Shimabuku that within 2 weeks had over 300 children participants. "Kids don't lie about who's treating them well," Rodriguez wrote to his mother. "When you see them laughing and playing, you know they're not scared anymore." The Japanese military watched this transformation with growing alarm. Lieutenant General Ushijima's headquarters issued increasingly desperate orders to civilian populations still in Japanese-controlled areas. A captured directive dated May 10, 1945, read, "Under no circumstances shall civilians surrender to American forces. Those who do are traitors to the Emperor and will be executed upon Japan's final victory. Families must choose honorable death over shameful surrender." Some obeyed. The mass suicide at Chibajiri Cave on April 16 claimed approximately 83 civilians who detonated grenades rather than surrender. Similar tragedies occurred at Tsunabe, Gyokusendo, and dozens of smaller caves. But as word spread about American treatment of surrendered civilians, these incidents decreased dramatically. The tipping point came in mid-May when Japanese soldiers began surrendering alongside civilians. These soldiers provided testimony that amplified civilian accounts. Private First Class Yoshida Takeshi, captured on May 18 near Shuri, told interrogators, "I watched Americans treat wounded civilians with medicine we didn't have for our own troops. I saw them distribute food we had stolen from villages to feed ourselves. When my squad leader ordered us to kill civilians attempting to surrender, half my squad refused. We were told Americans were barbarians. Instead, they acted with honor we had abandoned." By late May 1945, the pattern was established. Entire villages emerged from hiding not because American forces compelled them, but because starvation left no alternative and evidence suggested survival was possible. The Americans had weaponized humanitarian aid, transforming it into a psychological operation more effective than any bombing campaign. Miyagi Kikuko's family was processed through Camp Kina on May 2nd. Her brother received treatment for malnutrition and parasites. Her mother gained 12 pounds in the first 2 weeks. Kikuko herself attended the camp school, taught by Okinawan teachers under American supervision. "They taught us English phrases," she recalled, "not as conquerors forcing their language, but as preparation for whatever future awaited us. They acted like we had a future, which was more than we had, believed possible." The statistical record supports the narrative of systematic rescue. Of approximately 470,000 Okinawan civilians on the island when the battle began, between 100,000 and 150,000 died, most in the battle's first 60 days. But from late May through June, civilian death rates dropped dramatically as surrender became the norm rather than the exception. The American Civil Affairs section estimated they saved over 100,000 civilian lives through direct intervention and humanitarian operations. But saving lives created its own crisis. Over 200,000 displaced people required food, shelter, medical care, and eventually returned to destroyed homes. The logistics were staggering, and the solution would demonstrate American organizational capacity in ways that matched their military might. How do you rebuild a society while the battle to capture it still rages? The answer would emerge from an unlikely source: the civilians themselves, who began transforming from victims into participants in their own recovery. What happened next would prove that survival was only the beginning of the transformation. June 7, 1945, Camp Ishikawa's administration tent. Oshiro Kamado, a 42-year-old former schoolteacher, stood before 3 American officers with a handwritten proposal that would transform civilian camps from refugee centers into functional communities. The Americans had saved Okinawan lives. Now the Okinawans would teach them how to rebuild Okinawan society. Oshiro had emerged from the caves near Yonabaru on May 15th with his wife and 3 children. Within a week of arriving at Camp Ishikawa, he had identified the operation's critical weakness. Americans didn't understand Okinawan social structures, agricultural practices, or cultural protocols necessary for long-term civilian management. His solution was radical for its time: civilian self-governance within American oversight. Captain David Swift read Oshiro's proposal with growing recognition that traditional military administration wouldn't work for a population exceeding 70,000 people in this camp alone. Mr. Oshiro suggested establishing a civilian council to handle internal camp disputes, food distribution, oversight, and family services. Swift wrote in his June 8 report to Colonel Anderson. He argued that Okinawans would trust their own leaders more than American administrators for daily governance. I agreed immediately. By June 15th, 13 of the 16 civilian camps had established elected civilian councils. These councils, supervised but not controlled by American military government officers, managed everything from sanitation schedules to education programs. The transformation was profound. Refugees became citizens, camps became communities, and survival gave way to reconstruction planning. The agricultural program demonstrated this partnership most clearly. Okinawa's farming infrastructure had been devastated by 3 months of combat. Fields were cratered, irrigation systems destroyed, water buffalo killed for food by retreating Japanese forces, yet over 60% of Okinawa's pre-war population had been farmers, and their expertise represented the key to long-term food security. Lieutenant James Watanabe, a Nisei agriculture specialist from California's Central Valley, worked with Okinawan farmers to assess salvageable farmland near secured areas. His June report identified 47,000 acres that could be cultivated if cleared of unexploded ordnance and provided with seeds, tools, and irrigation repair. The challenge was immense. The solution came from the civilians themselves. Nakamura Seishin, a 58-year-old farmer from Itoman, proposed using civilian labor brigades to clear fields in exchange for priority access to farmland and equipment. "We cannot sit idle while Americans feed us," Nakamura told Lieutenant Watanabe through an interpreter. "Give us tools and we will rebuild our island. We know this land. We know what it can produce." By early July, over 12,000 Okinawan civilians were working in organized labor brigades, clearing fields, repairing roads, rebuilding irrigation systems, and salvaging usable materials from destroyed villages. The Americans provided engineering support, equipment, and ordnance disposal teams. The Okinawans provided knowledge, labor, and determination to reclaim their homeland. Civilians reclaiming agency, one field at a time. The first harvest came in late July, barely 90 days after the island's official surrender on June 22nd. Sweet potatoes, the Okinawan staple crop, were planted in cleared fields near Camp Koza and matured with unexpected speed in Okinawa's summer heat. The yield was modest, approximately 12 tons from 20 acres, but the psychological impact was immeasurable. Okinawans were feeding themselves again. Miyagi Kikuko's family was among those who returned to farming. Her father, previously too weak to work, recovered sufficiently to join a labor brigade in mid-June. By August, the family had been allocated 2 acres of cleared land near their destroyed village. "We planted sweet potatoes using shoots the Americans had brought from undamaged fields in the north," Kikuko recalled. "My father cried when the first shoots emerged from the soil. He said the land forgave us for surviving." But agricultural recovery was only one dimension of reconstruction. The Americans understood that social fabric required institutions beyond food production. Schools reopened in July, initially in tents, teaching a curriculum stripped of Japanese military propaganda. Okinawan teachers, vetted by American intelligence officers to exclude extreme militarists, taught in the Okinawan dialect rather than standard Japanese. A subtle but significant restoration of Okinawan identity that had been suppressed under Japanese rule. The school program revealed an unexpected consequence of American occupation. Many older Okinawans remembered Japanese annexation of the Ryukyu Kingdom in 1879 and the subsequent decades of forced Japanization. American emphasis on Okinawan language and culture, while partly pragmatic, resonated with a population that had never felt fully Japanese. This complexity would shape Okinawa's post-war identity in ways neither Americans nor Japanese anticipated. Religious institutions reopened with American approval. Buddhist temples and Shinto shrines that survived the battle became community centers. The Americans, products of a society with constitutional separation of church and state, made no attempt to restrict religious practice. This tolerance surprised Okinawans accustomed to state control of religious institutions under both Japanese and earlier Chinese influence. Father Miyazato Yoshio, a Buddhist priest who had hidden in caves near Nakagusuku, reopened his temple in July with American permission and material support. "They gave us lumber to repair the roof," he wrote in his restored journal. "They asked nothing in return, sought no control over our teachings. They simply said that people need spiritual comfort." This respect for traditions they did not share demonstrated a civilization more advanced than military power suggested. The medical infrastructure development showed American organizational capacity at its most impressive. By August, 32 permanent medical facilities operated across occupied Okinawa, staffed by American military doctors and nurses working alongside Okinawan medical personnel. These facilities treated not only war injuries but also diseases that had plagued Okinawa for generations: malaria, parasites, tuberculosis, and malnutrition-related conditions. Navy Doctor Commander Richard Hopkins established a training program for Okinawan medical assistants at the Ishikawa Hospital. "We needed local staff who understood the population and could communicate without interpreters," Hopkins wrote in his September report. "Within 6 weeks, we had trained 48 Okinawan medical assistants in basic nursing care, sanitation protocols, and preventive medicine. They became the foundation of Okinawa's post-war healthcare system." The statistics documented systematic progress. By September 1, 1945, civilian death rates had dropped to near pre-war levels. Birth rates, which had plummeted during the battle, began recovering as nutrition improved and stress decreased. Over 120,000 civilians had returned to secured home areas. Agricultural production was approaching 20% of pre-war levels and climbing monthly. But beneath these success stories lay profound trauma that numbers couldn't capture. Nearly every Okinawan family had lost members. Entire villages had been obliterated. The psychological wounds of mass civilian death, forced suicide, and betrayal by the Japanese military would take generations to heal. American humanitarian aid could address physical needs, but cultural recovery required something deeper, a reckoning with what had been lost and why. What the Americans hadn't anticipated was that their treatment of Okinawan civilians would create a permanent transformation in how Okinawans viewed both their former rulers and their former enemies. The seeds of this transformation, planted in caves and camps from April through August 1945, would bloom into something unprecedented in the post-war Pacific, a population that preferred American occupation to Japanese sovereignty. The implications of this preference would reshape the entire post-war order in the Pacific, creating complications that neither American planners nor Japanese officials had foreseen. The question wasn't whether America had won Okinawan hearts and minds. The question was what America would do with that victory in a world being rapidly reshaped by the coming Cold War. August 15, 1945, across Okinawa, American loudspeakers broadcast the Emperor's surrender announcement. In Camp Ishikawa, 70,000 Okinawan civilians listened in silence. Then something unexpected happened. They cheered. The reaction shocked American observers who had anticipated grief or perhaps relief, but not celebration. Yet the Okinawan response reflected a truth that American humanitarian operations had created. By August 1945, most Okinawans feared Japanese return more than American occupation. The Americans had not just saved civilian lives, they had fundamentally altered Okinawan political consciousness in ways that would reshape the Pacific for decades. Major Robert Sheridan, Chief Civil Affairs Officer at Ishikawa, recorded the scene in his duty log. "When the surrender announcement ended, I expected solemn reflection. Instead, civilians began embracing each other, some crying with relief. Several approached our interpreters, asking if this meant Americans would stay. When told we would maintain occupation authority, visible relief spread through the crowd. An elderly man told me, 'The Japanese taught us to die for the emperor. You taught us we could live for ourselves.'" This sentiment was not isolated. Post-surrender surveys conducted by American military government officers across all 16 civilian camps revealed that over 78% of Okinawans preferred continued American administration to return to Japanese sovereignty. This preference, unprecedented in the Pacific War, stemmed directly from the contrast between Japanese military conduct during the battle and American humanitarian response afterward. The Japanese 32nd Army had treated Okinawan civilians as expendable resources, villages were seized for military fortifications with no civilian consultation, food stores were confiscated without compensation, civilians were forced into caves as human shields. Families were given grenades and ordered to commit suicide rather than surrender. By conservative estimates, Japanese military actions directly caused between 30,000 and 40,000 civilian deaths through forced mass suicides, executions of those attempting to surrender, and use of civilians in combat zones. The Americans, despite conducting the most intensive naval bombardment and ground campaign in Pacific War history, had established hospitals for civilian wounded, distributed food to starving populations, and created the administrative framework for civilian self-governance. The contrast was absolute. Miyagi Kikuko, by now 17 years old and working as a translator for American Civil Affairs, summarized the transformation in her September diary entry. 4 months ago, I believed Americans were demons. Today, I teach Okinawan children English so they can communicate with the soldiers who saved us. My brother, who nearly starved in the caves, now plays baseball with American soldiers who give him chocolate. My father, who prepared to kill our family rather than surrender, now works rebuilding the roads that will connect our island. We are not the same people who entered those caves. We have been transformed by mercy we did not expect and kindness we did not deserve. The demographic data revealed the scale of American humanitarian success. Between April and December 1945, American forces processed, fed, sheltered, and provided medical care to over 240,000 Okinawan civilians. Mortality rates in civilian camps ran below 2%, despite initial conditions of widespread malnutrition and disease. Over 93% of displaced civilians returned to home areas or resettlement locations by January 1946. Agricultural production reached 60% of pre-war levels by spring 1946, despite massive infrastructure damage. These numbers represented more than administrative efficiency. They documented the systematic implementation of humanitarian principles during active combat operations, a combination that military historians have noted was virtually unique in the Second World War's Pacific theater. Evidence of transformation written in survival statistics. The Okinawan preference for American administration created immediate political complications. The Japanese government, preparing for American occupation of the home islands, expected to retain sovereignty over Okinawa as part of Japan proper. The Okinawan population, however, had effectively voted with their feet for separation from Japanese control. American strategic planners recognized Okinawa's value as a permanent military base, but had not anticipated governing a civilian population that actively preferred American rule to repatriation. The solution emerged in September 1945, when the United States Ryukyu Command was established as a military government separate from the occupation administration in mainland Japan. Okinawa would remain under direct American military administration, while the rest of Japan transitioned to civilian government oversight. This arrangement, initially conceived as temporary, would last 27 years until Okinawa's reversion to Japanese sovereignty in 1972. During those 27 years, Okinawa developed a unique hybrid culture. American investment rebuilt infrastructure devastated by war. English became a common second language. Democratic institutions introduced in the refugee camps evolved into civilian governance structures. Yet, Okinawan language, customs, and cultural identity not only survived, but flourished without the aggressive Japanization policies that had characterized pre-war rule. Oshiro Kamado, the school teacher who had proposed civilian councils in June 1945, became Chief Education Officer for the Ryukyu government in 1953. In his memoirs published in 1978, he reflected, "The Americans saved our lives in 1945. They saved our culture by allowing us to govern ourselves while providing resources we lacked. They were conquerors who chose to be partners." This paradox defined the post-war Okinawan experience. Not everyone viewed the American presence positively. By the 1960s, as Cold War tensions escalated and American military bases expanded across Okinawa, many Okinawans chafed under military government restrictions and sought reversion to Japan. The humanitarian rescue of 1945 became complicated by 25 years of occupation policies that sometimes prioritized American military interests over Okinawan civilian needs. Yet even critics of American occupation acknowledged the foundation laid in those first months after the battle. The infrastructure, institutions, and democratic practices established during the humanitarian crisis of 1945 created frameworks that survived reversion and continue shaping Okinawa today. Miyagi Kikuko lived until 2008. In her final interview, conducted when she was 80 years old, she addressed the complexity of Okinawa's relationship with America. People ask if I'm grateful to Americans for saving my life. The answer is complicated. I'm grateful for the mercy shown in 1945, when mercy was unexpected. I'm troubled by decades of base politics that treated Okinawa as American territory. Both truths exist together. What I know with certainty is that the Americans who called into our cave in April 1945, who waited while we debated death or surrender, who fed us when we emerged, who treated us as humans worthy of dignity, those Americans changed the course of our history. We expected demons. We found humans who chose mercy when they could have chosen indifference. That choice saved over 200,000 lives. Whatever came after, that truth remains. The story of Okinawan civilians in 1945 stands as testament to a principle often forgotten in war. How victors treat defeated populations shapes post-war peace more than how battles are won. The American humanitarian operation on Okinawa succeeded not through superior propaganda, but through systematic demonstration that survival with dignity was possible. Japanese propaganda had taught Okinawans that surrender meant death. American actions proved that surrender meant life. Tens of thousands had been driven into caves and jungles, starving and sick. They expected no mercy. When captured, they were handed food, protection, and eventually the tools to rebuild their society. Slowly, whole villages surrendered, realizing the Americans were their best chance not just of survival, but of reclaiming the future the war had stolen. The transformation was complete. Enemies had become allies, refugees had become citizens, and mercy had proven more powerful than force. In the caves of Okinawa, in the refugee camps, in the rebuilt fields and schools, American humanitarian operations achieved something military victory alone could never accomplish. They created a population that believed in the possibility of peace because they had witnessed compassion in the midst of war. That belief, forged in the darkness of limestone caves and the light of liberation, remains Okinawa's most enduring legacy from the spring and summer of 1945, when the world learned that saving lives could be as strategically important as taking territory, and that humanity could survive even the most brutal of wars.